this should be a wake-up call for everyone.
Penny Mordaunt, we heard from former intelligence officer Christopher Steele a little while ago just saying that it's possible that Russia could be involved. Very speculative, of course. Heidi Alexander, Transport Secretary, says there is no suggestion of foul play. But nevertheless, it has very much advertised to the Russians, hasn't it, the vulnerability of our infrastructure?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, thanks to our emergency services for all they've done, and sympathies with everyone affected by this. But I also have sympathies for our emergency planners, because we have an incredible emergency planning community, world class in this country. We've got people at Cambridge who are thinking about what will happen if an asteroid hits the Earth. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have amazing local resilience forums with armies of volunteers that were the first line of response in COVID and go out and grit the roads when there's bad weather. So we have some amazing organisations and people in this country looking at emergency planning. The problem is Whitehall doesn't. We've got a national risk register, we have a resilience strategy, we have private sector forums that look at precisely this sort of risk with our energy supplies. We've got experts in the House of Lords that feed into this whole process. The problem is that this is not interesting enough to many ministers, and it's not acted on. So this should be a wake-up call for everyone. And the questions I would be asking are about. Sorry, power's just gone off in my in the room.
It's the Russians.
I think it's net zero initiatives that I'll have to move around a bit more. But,
Ed Miliband.
I would be asking, when is the last time that the private sector resilience forum that looks at critical national infrastructure and services met? Because it should meet a couple of times a year. And I want to know who is on the risk register to being responsible for this situation. And when was the last time that COBRA was stood up for this sort of event? Because the other thing that Whitehall doesn't do enough of is exercise.
Well, let's just cut now. I'll come to you, Jonathan, in just a second. But let's just hear from the Heathrow boss, Thomas Wolby, who's just been speaking. Here he is.
For tomorrow, again, what's the picture going to be, and who can expect to be flying?
Tomorrow morning, we expect to be back in full operation, so 100% operation as a normal day.
So people who are booked for tomorrow morning can expect to fly normally, and what should they do?
They should come to the airport as they normally would. There's no reason to come earlier. They should be coming to the airport as they were planning to do otherwise.
How would you sum up what's happened today, just in terms of the operation of this airport?
Yeah. First of all, what I'd like to do is to apologise to the many people who have had their travel affected during the day-to-day. We are very sorry about all the inconvenience. I also like to thank the many people who have been part of bringing the airport back into operation. That is fire services, authorities, our airlines, handlers, and our own colleagues who've done an enormous work to get back into operation. What happened around midnight last night was obviously that we lost a major part of our power supply, and I like to stress that this has been an incident of major severity. It's not a small fire. We have lost power equal to that of a mid-sized city, and our backup systems have been working as they should, but they are not sized to run the entire airport.
I'll come back to that in a second, but I wanted to ask, I can't remember in a long history of covering this airport a time like this, a day like this. How would you put what's happened today in context?
This is unprecedented. It's never happened before, and that's why I'm saying it has been a major incident. Of course, everybody has been shocked, but all our procedures have been working the way they should. I hope people appreciate that we do not close down the airport unless we have severe safety concerns. That's why we do it, and that's what has happened today. We've been working tirelessly to get the operation back into running, and that's what's now happening.
So let's look at the power failure. What were you told, and when were you told what had happened?
Very early during the night, obviously, as soon as we realized the magnitude of this. And then all our procedures went into force, and we've been working ever since. First to reallocate our power supply. That means closing down all our systems and then restarting all these systems in a safe way, which takes a long time.
That was the Heathrow boss speaking just a little bit earlier. John, your reaction to that?
Well, like Penny, I think there's a question here about resilience and security, and the government, the Cabinet Office, they're in charge of this. Cabinet Office ministers would come to Parliament year after year to give national resilience updates, to talk about what is on the risk register. But it's certainly true that it does look like, I mean, I've not been a Cabinet Office minister like Penny has, so I think her insight is really valuable here. It does look like that things come along that somehow Whitehall never seems to have prepared for. And I think many of the listeners today will find it absolutely extraordinary that the energy supplies to our major airport, an international hub airport, are so reliant on this, what appears to be an incredibly vulnerable power station.
It is a wake-up call. You accept that?
No, I agree. I absolutely. I think Penny is right. And just to sort of make another observation, which isn't necessarily about the airport. I mean, we're about 5 years on, roughly, from going into lockdown. I'm not opening up a debate about lockdown. I'm just sort of making the point that, a COVID pandemic was not one that was prepared for. We always assumed we would be hit by a flu pandemic. And in the early days of that pandemic, decisions were made, which were probably at the time thought to be the right decisions. But obviously, looking back, it was because they were preparing for a flu pandemic. And, these things always come along somehow, and we seem to miss them, don't we? We don't seem to be prepared for the things that are going to hit us.
Well, I think we can hear from the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, now. Let's take a bit of that.
Met police at pace to understand what the cause of the fire was. This was clearly a substation that is very close to a critical piece of national infrastructure. So it's imperative that we've got the right people working on that investigation to identify the cause as soon as possible. This has been an unprecedented situation that has been totally outside of Heathrow's control. They have stood up their resilience plan swiftly, and they've collaborated closely with our emergency responders and the airline operators. They do have backup energy supplies. They have generators, diesel generators. None of that failed on this occasion because that backup supply is designed to protect the critical key systems within the airport and not to provide power to the whole airport. It's important to remember that large airports such as Heathrow take up about as much energy as a small city. And so I've spoken to the Chief Executive of Heathrow about what has happened and any lessons that might be learned for the future. But I'm confident that Heathrow is a world-class airport that provides excellent services day in, day out to millions of passengers and businesses all over the world.
That was the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, speaking a few moments ago. Let's move on now to actually one of the big stories of the week, which has been Donald Trump and Putin. He began the week with a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Didn't seem to reap too many rewards. A ceasefire only on the table for the Kremlin if a lot of conditions were met. The White House then called up Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, a conversation that went far more smoothly than that Barney in the Oval Office. And today, President Trump has turned his attention to NATO during a media briefing in the White House.
NATO is something that I saved. NATO was gone until I came along. In fact, the previous Secretary General, very good man. Both of them are good. The current man is fantastic. But both of them have said, if it wasn't for Trump, you wouldn't even have a NATO, because we were paying the cost of almost all of the countries, and now they're paying. I said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to continue. You hurt us on trade. You do bad things on trade, and then on top of it, we're supposed to pay for your military.
Well, that was Donald Trump talking in the White House today. Penny, he's basically so far given Vladimir Putin everything that he wants, hasn't he? And what are we supposed to do about this?
Well, look, I always was of the school of thought that before Hegseth went to Munich, that the negotiations between Trump and Putin were done. I didn't believe that he would give away so much as he did by talking about not, for example, having membership of NATO, unless he had secured some things from President Putin. And I think over the next few weeks, we're going to find out whether that is the case or whether the president doesn't actually have any cards at all. I think he's right about NATO. I think NATO is strong. I've always been optimistic about that, and I think that he's been right to throw the gauntlet down to Europe to step up. But NATO itself is talking about us spending 3% on defence. And if we can't rely on the US to fund Europe's defence, or the large part of it in the future, Europe is going to have to do that. So I'm going to cut the government some slack. It might not be the exact moment to announce an increase in defence spending while these negotiations are going on. But we are going to have to do that, and it'll be interesting to see whether we see any signs from Rachel Reeves next week that there is going to be an uplift that could take us to 3%.
John, brief response from you.
Well, obviously the government's already announced that it's going to increase spending to 2.5. It's got an ambition for 3. I think given the state of the public finances, I would be surprised if we had a 3% uplift. But look, who knows? It's basic arithmetic. If you're giving more money to defence, you're giving less money to something else. And Penny will remember from her days in cabinet that all the different cabinet ministers will be making the best cases they possibly can for their own departments. But look, I obviously want to see an increase in defence expenditure as well. I think we have to do that. I think the old assumptions about the rule-based order have been upended, and there is no greater duty of any government than the defence and security of its people. But to get to 3%, government's got to take some tough decisions.
Right.